All right, let's get into it. We're going to talk about a single statement, just one sentence, really, that went on to define American foreign policy for like a whole century. I mean, this was a declaration that literally shaped the map of the entire Western Hemisphere.
So picture this. It's December 1823. President James Monroe is giving his big annual message to Congress, and he just lays down this marker. It was this incredibly bold warning, basically telling the old, powerful empires of Europe, hey, the Americas, yeah, we're not open for business anymore. No more colonization here.
And here it is. This is the line that just echoed through history. Think about it. This single sentence was this massive declaration from a pretty young nation. It was like drawing a huge line in the sand against all the old powers of the world. So you got to ask, right? Where did an idea this audacious even come from?
Well, to really get the doctrine, you have to get the man who announced it and the seriously chaotic world he was living in.
So here he is, James Monroe, the fifth president of the United States. And what's really crucial to remember about him is that he was the last of the founding father generation to be president. He was a living, breathing link back to the country's fight for independence.
And man, his whole life story just screams this. He fought in the Revolution and was actually wounded. He served as a governor. He was Secretary of State and Secretary of War for Madison during the War of 1812. You see, this entire lifetime of service gave him a super personal view on American independence, and he knew firsthand just how fragile it really was. Okay, so the world back in 1823, it was basically a giant chessboard of collapsing empires and new ambitions. Spain's huge colonial empire was just crumbling. You had all these new republics popping up and declaring independence all across Latin America. But, and this is a big but, there was a very real threat that other European monarchies, this group they called the Holy Alliance, might just decide to step in, help Spain out, and crush these brand new nations. So with that threat looming, Monroe's administration had this massive decision on its hands. What was America going to do about it? And this led to a really fascinating choice. Great Britain, which saw a huge chance to make money trading with these new Latin American countries, came to the U.S. with an offer. They said, hey, let's issue a joint warning together. Now, teaming up with the biggest navy on the planet? Super tempting. But there was a pretty big catch. And this is where his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, comes into the picture. He argued, super passionately against the joint deal. He said it would make the U.S. look like a tiny little boat just tagging along behind this massive British warship. He convinced Monroe that America had to speak for itself, that making its own independent statement was, in a way, like a second Declaration of Independence. So the final doctrine, which Monroe wrote with a ton of input from Adams, really boiled down to two simple but super powerful pillars. Pillar 1, no more European colonies in the Americas, period. Pillar 2, the U.S. promises to stay out of Europe's affairs, and in return, Europe needs to stay out of the affairs of all these new independent republics over here. But here's where the story takes a really interesting twist. Because this statement, which started out as just a defensive warning to Europe, would, over the next 100 years or so, completely transform into something very different. Fast forward about 80 years, we've got President Theodore Roosevelt in the White House, and he adds this major extension to the doctrine. See, European countries were threatening to send troops into Latin America to collect on debts, and Roosevelt basically said, nope. He declared that the U.S. itself had the right to step in and act as an international police power in the whole region. Yeah, his own words really show you just how much things had changed. Roosevelt's thinking was basically, look, to keep Europe out, sometimes we have to go in first to make sure there's order and stability. Think about that difference. The original doctrine was all about keeping other countries out. This new version, the corollary, was all about justifying when the U.S. could go in. And this corollary, it was not just talk, not at all. It became the justification for a whole series of American interventions all over Latin America and the Caribbean. We're talking about sending in the Marines, taking over a country's finances, all of it done under the banner of the Monroe Doctrine. I mean, the principles of this doctrine became so deeply ingrained in American thinking that they were even brought up symbolically almost 140 years later. And we're talking about during maybe the most tense moment of the entire Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, as the U.S. was trying to block Soviet influence right in its own hemisphere. So all of this whole evolution, it brings us to the big debate, the one about the doctrine's long and honestly pretty complicated legacy.
And it really leaves us with this central question. How are we supposed to look at this thing? Was it a protective shield, a noble idea meant to protect these new, vulnerable republics? Or did it just become a convenient excuse for the U.S. to dominate its own backyard?
Well, the truth is, its legacy is totally two-sided. On the one hand, back in the early days, it was a powerful statement that probably did help scare off European powers from trying to recolonize. But as America got more and more powerful, the doctrine itself was transformed into a tool, a justification for America's own sphere of influence and its own interventions. And that brings us to a final, pretty thought-provoking question for today. In our world, a world that's so global and interconnected, what does a regional sphere of interest even mean anymore? It's a question that started with one president drawing a bold line in the sand over 200 years ago. And believe it or not, it's a question we are still trying to figure out.